you would have probably called me what people refer to as a cultural Christian, where it's more just the consequence of where you were born, who raised you, what you were brought up around. I had all the knowledge in my head, but had not really earnestly tried to apply it until it was in my mid-teens. It was also around that time that there was a good deal of conflict in my home, where I think some of my siblings also struggled with faith, and they were very influential to me. But at the same time, I had a lot of good influences at the same time. So really, what subsequently happened, where I left the faith in my late 20s or early 20s, sorry, was really just more a consequence of me making my choice. I think James 1:8 was called to my heart at the time, and I didn't really understand why. And it's just very simply the double-minded man is unstable in all he does. And oh, at the time I would have not thought that about myself, which is why it didn't really make sense about me. I would say that through my 20s, God kept calling me, and I kept going my own way. It was in my 20s then that I adopted kind of like a pretty strong anti-religion stance because, I had too much conflict inside, I think, to have a hands-off, like ambivalent, like, I don't care kind of stance. I was like, I have to put this in its box, and feel like I have, some sort of control over it. And it wasn't until say about 2015, I had finished college, and it was then clear that I might end up marrying the girlfriend that I was with at the time. And when the father learned of this, he tried to introduce Islam to me, and we had a lot of really great discussions. I remember a lot of them really fondly. Um, Ironically, yeah, this did lead me to eventually coming to Christ. Now, my girlfriend at the time was an atheist, and he was convinced that I would be the one to kind of get her on, the best path. And I think a lot of people would have been maybe felt like this was imposing or been irritated by it. I took it as, from his perspective, he was trying to help me, you know. So out of respect for him, he'd send me some materials and things like that, and I got a copy of the Quran. And I told him I was going to read it, and I was reading. I think I got about 60% of the way through it, but I had broken up with my girlfriend afterwards. So I never did finish that. So, anyways, following that, I would always look at religions if I were evaluating them with a question of, does this look like something that came from people of the time, or does this look like something that came from, God, or you know something outside mankind? So I guess that was kind of my take on reading the Quran. A lot of it is it just felt like it just came from exactly its time period, and I contrasted that with what I'd known about Jesus, um, where a lot of his teachings take people 180 degrees differently from what their base tribalistic instincts would be, and it's like, where did that come from? Like, um, that bothered me back then, because I had tried to put it into its neat little box, and it kept trying to jump out on me. I think part of what powered me through it too is, I had a yearning and a hunger for God at the time, and I also did have this eerie sense that the world around me was playing out in accordance to what I understood from scriptures as a child. Um, and a big part of the reason I left early on was very much the opposite of that, where I was thinking that, all this stuff that I had been brought up with was not consistent with the world. It's just as time went on, I definitely got the other impression. I think that and many other things was just a manifestation of the yearning that I had inside, you know. So It was about 2016. I broke up with my ex. She had kind of realized that marriage was not on the table for her with me or with anybody, and just she realized fundamentally she didn't like the idea. So that became one of many irreconcilable differences. And from there, I did call my mother and said, told her I'd be going back to church again. So my first experience back in church was, um, I had a lot of the familiar aesthetics, sights and sounds. I grew up in a Reformed Presbyterian church, so there's a very certain set of liturgy of, the way things sound, the hymns. You, there was a lot of familiarity there that I was drawn to, but it seemed more like the doctrine was worldly and that it was not really emphasizing the Word of God. Now, I had been raised, in Bible-believing churches, as they would say. Um, so I continued looking for that. And, I think this really kind of illustrates the importance of a church community where I came to Terra because of people that had kind of maybe unwittingly mentored me. I had a coworker, Jeff Chatterton, who told me one night at a work dinner that he played at Terra, and we were all discussing the different musical instruments we played. So it was that night I said, I want to come see you play. So then I, had been coming here consistently ever since. Another person that had a lot of good impact on me, I think, was Paul Feketa. Um, ever since I walked through the door, he wanted to draw me into, his group of outdoors adventurers. But really, one of the most impactful things from Paul, which just blows my mind to this day, was 2017 in July. We were camping in Wilmington with a lot of folks, some from Terra and some from other places. And after a couple of days, I said, Paul, look, I'm having such a good time. Could you please just send me some of these pictures? We've been hiking. There's just a lot of cool stuff I thought was memorable. And Paul said, hey, just get them on Facebook. And I was really disappointed by that because I had deliberately been off all social media at that point since about 2014 when I was, still finishing my mechanical engineering degree. And I felt like social media was a distraction, and I had felt totally fine about being away from it up to that point. So I had no interest whatsoever in getting back on Facebook. But Paul's like, no, just make a Facebook account. You'll get all the pictures. It's easier that way. So, I relented and I made a Facebook account. So following that camping trip, I asked the Lord to show me something I couldn't even deny. So it was within 2 weeks of then, I was contacted by the mother of a daughter I never knew I had on Facebook as a direct consequence of all of this. And, to this day, that's Alyssa. She was 16 at the time. We've become very close. And to me, that was pretty remarkable. In the back of my head, I was like, well, just keep in mind, you're not necessarily supposed to lay Gideon's fleece, as they say, where you're asking for signs. And I did a little research on that too, and for sure, there's a few verses that kind of discourage it. But at the same time, the way that I look at it now is that God just met me where I was at the time, and in kindness, still, answered me directly. And when I look back at that now, and I think of this idea of like, you can knock, and those who seek will find it. I think I just combined two different verses there. But it's almost like at the same time, it's you should almost be afraid that he'll answer because sometimes he just really does and turns things completely upside down. Not necessarily for the worse, but in a way that is pretty remarkable to me. Peter's grief when he denied Christ, I think, had a lot to do with how close he really was to God. He had been with Jesus as he was here on earth, and coming back to the Lord has filled me with so much gratitude. And a big part of it is because I had the benefit of a really good upbringing. I had all these ideas placed in front of me, and I knew them very well. And I had the benefit of a close walk with the Lord in my teens in my memory, where I could have some idea of what that's like. Where some people might not have that stuff presented to them, they don't necessarily have that experience to look back on and say, oh, that exists. So I'm filled with that much more gratitude, I think, because um, it's a gift that I, truly don't deserve. Yeah. So what I would say is, I continued struggling and I continued sinning, and the verse in James kept being thematic because it was very difficult, even back in 2017, um, where I still had my old ways of thinking, and I still had my old ways of how do I find comfort or entertainment or you know what what makes me get up in the morning kind of thing. So this an overnight transformation of um, being very worldly and also having a philosophical mindset where faith almost couldn't exist within that framework was difficult. So I was double-minded in all those respects, and I think that as I incorporated more and more of necessary parts of Christian life into my life, a lot of that just melted away. And a big change was, last year, 2024, where I undertook a challenge with two of my friends to just not drink alcohol for the entire year. And I think that one big thing I was lacking in my Christian life, 2017 up until that point, was prayer. Um, I prayed, you know, I prayed at church and I even prayed on my own, but it was never, I didn't abide in prayer. It was not an everyday thing. But that year where we didn't drink, I prayed every day because that took work every day. So every day it was, I'm giving thanks that I did it. I made it through, and also, God, please give me strength to finish this out. Well, me and my two friends finished that successfully, and I found that was a big game changer in my life, like majorly, and that led me very much to where I am now, where when I heard baptism was something that was coming, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I don't recall ever having done that as an adult. I was baptized as a child, which I think is more a symbol of that family dedicating this child to God and the community dedicating their efforts to bringing them up in that tradition. But it's not something the baby's doing, you know. So I thought, now's the time for me to do that because I genuinely have taken a lot of steps to sanctify my life, and I would like to continue doing that. So yeah, I mentioned James 1:8, and another verse that was called to my heart a long, long time ago, and I never really knew why, was Matthew 25, where it has the parable of the three servants, the talents. And I always liked that it was talents because obviously back then that was a currency. But the way that I interpret that, or at least one of the ways that I interpret that, is that people have talents. And, I looked at the three different servants, and, what was the response of the third one who took his one coin and buried it into the ground. And this verse stuck in my head so much where I would just be going about my daily business, and you'd have the good and faithful servant. That phrase would pop into my head randomly. I'm like going, probably doing something totally different. I'm like, what's that for? Okay, I'll think about that later. Um, but I think what I've come to view that as is it really shows the attitude of the person with respect to the Creator, what you do with what's been given to you. And it struck me then that I think that for a lot of the time I had been, metaphorically burying the coin, where I have things that I could, um, even if it's not in a religious context. I've always been a very private person, kind of keep to myself. I like to be buried in my books or, whatever I happen to be fascinated in, but I'm not putting a lot more out there. And I thought, at least this outward sign of baptism, this is also for the people that are viewing it. It's my commitment to God, but it's also an outward sign that other people are seeing. I'm not going into a closet somewhere and, secretly doing it. So I thought a lot about this too when it came time to do this video, because I don't feel I'm naturally suited to this at all. And my inner inclination is like, hey, I want to write this down. We've got a testimonial in written form. That should be good enough. And I don't want to necessarily show people or whatever. And immediately, as those thoughts are coming into my head, I'm like, well, this is the servant who buried the coin. So um, I'd say this is a big part of the reason I want to do this.